Right, we'll get started this afternoon. The subject is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and World War II. To give you some idea, the United States Senate was violently opposed to the entry into World War II, and they made that very clear to the President of the White House. They felt that we had lost a national treasure in men and material in the battles of World War I, all for nothing. And now here we were back 20 years again, facing this catastrophe. And so the Senate was of opinion no more. Now, before I go any deeper into that, I want to tell you that I received a phone call last week by a very good friend of mine, Louis Wild. Louis lives here with me in Piedmont Gardens. He said how much he enjoyed the FDR lecture on politics last week, but he was concerned about something I left out. He had heard from his parents about a ship that came in 1939 to American waters. In fact, it came first to Cuba. There, its passengers list over 500 German Jews were desperate for a homeland. The Cuban government refused them entry. The ship then went offshore of Miami and sat there looking at the lights beyond the 3-mile limits. They also asked and were refused entry into the United States. This became known to Eleanor Roosevelt, who approached Franklin about it as a disaster. Franklin's answer was, Eleanor, you are a humanitarian. I am a politician. I have to wait for people to wait in line to get visas to come here. And these people, if I let them come, many more will come, upsetting the balance in this country. So I am not going to do anything. And so the ship finally returned its passengers to Europe. And most of those Jewish passengers went to the death camps. It is also true that much of the New York literati at the time was Jewish, and they also raised no ruckus. So in many ways, we failed, as Franklin failed the Japanese Americans in the internment camps, and also failed the African Americans in the South, given his famous coalition. So enough said on that. Franklin is not perfect and had these major handicaps, but he did see himself always as a politician who had to get reelected, and he was reelected 4 times, but he paid a mighty cost. And Eleanor picked that up by saying, I am a humanitarian and we should do these other things. All right, enough. Adolf Hitler is a man who came to power out of Austria. He's not German-born, he's Austrian, Linz. He did serve in World War I as a corporal on the side of the German Reich and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They lost. In the 1920s, in fact, at a very fateful day in the history of München, the wonderful capital of Bavaria. Actually, it was on November the 8th, 1923, Hitler tried to have a beer hall push. It did not succeed. He was arrested, found guilty. So the first striving of fascism is not in the 1930s, but is evolved in European politics as early as the 20s, and very, very involved in Italian politics. In fact, Mussolini comes to power as a fascist leader of Italy in the 20s, before Mr. Hitler gets into office. So it was that events spiraled out of hand. The crash that came in 1929 ruined international markets in the Western and the Eastern world. So it was that we struggled into the 1930s. We get FDR as president. Hoover is failing to recover the American economy. And we have those many, many years of Franklin working on the economy here at home. At the same time as these terrible events take place in Europe, Franklin remains very tuned in to this and is very anxious to be of help to what he considers the Allies. Now, in the middle of the 1930s, there is a rehearsal war for the great Second War to come. This rehearsal war is staged in Spain. The Spanish Republic is tottering. It's being attacked from within by the caudillo himself, Francisco Franco. Franco is going to be, unfortunately, successful in toppling the Republic. And three of the great writers of that time are going to write about that. In our case, it's Ernest Hemingway in his third great book, For Whom the Bells Toll, which was made into a great American film starring Gary Cooper and Ingrid Bergman, and actually was filmed not far from here in the foothills of the Sierras in a very small town where also High Noon was filmed. So someday, if ever this pandemic is over, perhaps we can make a field trip to that location. It's a wonderful town, wonderful hotel, the place where all the stars stayed, Grace Kelly and Gary Cooper the first time, the second time, Ingrid Bergman and Gary Cooper. For Whom the Bells Toll is the great American version of the Spanish Civil War and its loss. In the case of the British, there is a wonderful book called Goodbye to Catalonia. And then there is a third book by the great Frenchman, André Malraux, called Man's Hope. Malraux is the man who comes to power after World War II with de Gaulle's government, and he's famous for cleaning up the city of Paris, which today is sparkling clean because they don't burn coal there anymore. And so coal does not fall over those creamy buildings in Paris itself. 3 books, 3 authors, 3 attempts, but London, Paris, and Washington will not lift a finger. So the Republic goes down to defeat. And it's a rehearsal war in the sense that the regime that Hitler establishes finally in Berlin does aid, and Mussolini sends aid. And in the case of rehearsing, the Germans sent the famous Condor Legion, which was a group of fighting planes, all in one unit called the Condor Legion. They were dive bombers, Stukas. And on a fateful market day in the 1930s, a small village was obliterated. That is Guernica. It's an offering to the war gods. And it so outraged a fairly unknown guy still living in France by the name of Pablo Picasso that he painted or sketched one of his masterpieces, the Guernica, which for many years hung in the New York Modern Museum, MoMA, with the desire that Picasso had that it be returned to Madrid when in fact Francisco Franco was gone. And now that he's gone, the Guernica has left New York City and it is back in Madrid in the Reina Sofia Museum, where it magnificently stands out as the best piece of anti-war art created during this terrible period of European and world history. But what are the Americans doing? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And everyone in the Senate is watching the White House carefully to make sure that man in the White House does not drift us towards war. And he is drifting towards war. When, on September the 1st, 1939, the Wehrmacht, that is the German High Command, sent its military across the Polish frontier in a massive invasion, Notes came from Paris, from the Quai d'Orsay, and from London, from the Foreign Office, to the Wilhelmstrasse, which is the German Foreign Office in Berlin. And the note said that if within 24 hours German forces do not withdraw from Poland, a state of war exists between France and Britain. And the Germans did not withdraw. In fact, they'd earlier signed a pact with the devil. They had a foreign minister, von Ribbentrop, and of course, Stalin in the Soviet Union had a foreign minister, Molotov. So Molotov and von Ribbentrop signed a non-aggression agreement that they would both be willing to see the other take a huge slice of Poland, and they both did. And so Poland effectively disappeared. This would play not to Stalin's advantage sometime later. But now you have this strange war. There's no war in the West. It's called the Winter War that did not exist. In the meantime, British politics is in a turmoil. To begin with, during the period before the war, the British were stuck with a very stupid man who would be king. The family called him David. His official name is Edward VIII. But Edward had this odd fascination with this, what should we call her? Well, some would call her a prostitute. Her name is Wallis Warfield Simpson. And David insisted he must have her as his queen. And Baldwin, who was prime minister, sourced this out to the Commonwealth. Canadians voted no, Australians no, New Zealand no, South Africa no was the answer throughout the Commonwealth. They would not have her, this American twice divorced woman, as their queen. So it was that on a fateful night, his father now dead and Edward now king, except not yet crowned, goes to Balmoral and abdicates his throne, quote, for the woman I love, end quote. Now these two dopes saw fit to visit Herr Hitler even before the war, going as far as visiting him down in Berchtesgaden. Later, when they're living in Paris, where he has his new residence since he has been more or less thrown out of Britain, he lives in the famous woods of Boulogne. And when it comes time, he has to be evacuated rapidly across the Pyrenees to Spain, where a British warship waits and takes him all the way to the Bahamas, where he is instructed by the new prime minister, who happens to be Winston Churchill, that you are to stay in the Bahamas for the duration of the war. Signed, Winston. But Winston was not the prime minister at the beginning of the war, because Britain was desperate for peace. She had suffered so terribly in World War I, and now 20 years later for war to come again. So they had as a prime minister Neville Chamberlain. And Chamberlain himself went and met with Hitler and finally ceded the rights of the Czech people away. Czechoslovakia, a new country born after World War I in the Treaty of Versailles, is now going to be given up to Herr Hitler, who's demanding a strip of land in the Czech Republic known as the Sudetenland, because there are a lot of ethnic Germans living there. And so it is that Chamberlain, carrying his famous umbrella, returns to London and makes a pronouncement, peace in our time. Well, it was to be a false peace, for Hitler had much bigger ambitions than just the Sudetenland. He had the Anschluss, which was to incorporate all of Austria into the German Reich, which he does. So now you're stuck with a series of events. Even Americans have odd feelings towards Herr Hitler. We had a famous writer who'd given us great Nobel Prize winning novels, Main Street, Babbitt, Arrowsmith. His name is Sinclair Lewis. He wrote us a quick little piece called It Can't Happen Here. What he's saying is that fascism can even come to America. Just look at us. So I used to tell my Berkeley students, fascism was always fashionable. Fascism is an ideology that incorporates big government, big labor, and then big money into a system of government that allows a few to despoil the many. Very successfully, by the way. Today we call it a new version called corporatism, but all the same, it is not a democracy in the sense of for the people, by the people. It's for the few, the very few. So nevertheless, Britain is stuck with Chamberlain. We've watched our own golden boy from the 20s, roaring 20s, the guy who flew the Atlantic in a single-engine plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. He also goes to see Hitler's Third Reich. He's very, very impressed with the Luftwaffe, these strikingly beautiful new airplanes that, of course, are being designed so they can bomb Warsaw, Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and then launch a blitz against all the British cities. Something really to admire. So the West was befooled by a lot of fools, and we were among those fools. And still, Chamberlain held on in London as Prime Minister. He was going to give Britain peace in our time. But finally, when use of a quisling, that is an internal spy, in the case of Norway, his name is Quisling, the Norwegians are overcome and Hitler's forces take Norway. And when Norway falls, the handwriting is on the wall. And so it is that Chamberlain's government falls. And this very strange bulldog of a man with an American wife of all, American mother of all things, married to a very wonderful British woman, Clementine. Sir Winston Churchill becomes Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and will lead Britain through the war and will do anything he can to defeat Hitler, to include bringing himself to go to Moscow to see Stalin and try and get Stalin into the war and saying out loud, I would go to hell itself and make an arrangement with the devil if I could get him to fight Herr Hitler. And it won't be long, because Hitler does finally turn his attention to what is his major Western enemy at the time, which of course is the French Republic. And initially, of course, surrounded by sycophants and others in the German High Command, they planned to repeat the von Schlieffen plan from World War II. That is to cut near Liège into Belgium and then sweep down. But there is a younger group of generals. You have to understand that the senior service in Germany has always been the army. And this younger person is, in fact, a man named von Manstein. And von Manstein presents another plan, a better plan, because the Germans have perfected the tank. And the Germans perceive that if they follow a kind of Napoleonic strategy, which is to punch through the French front and to find the weakest place on that front, bursting through by massing their tanks, then breaking into the back of the French lines and cutting the lines left and right, developing it as it develops, not on any strict schedule, they will be able to quickly bring France to its knees. And unbelievably, they're right. There is a wooded area of hills in the German-French border called the Ardennes. And it's assumed that no modern military could get through those woods. Well, it's wrong. They could, and they did. They poured through the Ardennes, came up and behind the French lines, cut all the lines of communication so that the generals could no longer command their forces. This is strange that they did this with their panzers because the French had actually developed the best tank, but they had used it incorrectly. They had taken one and put one with each battalion instead of using them as a fighting force together. So it was that the unbelievable happened. Churchill begged the French to stay in the war. He flew over to Paris. Nothing would work. The French sought an armistice. And so it was that an armistice was signed. France divided into two parts. The north, with Paris as its capital, would be occupied France, and the south would be Vichy, or Free France, with the capital at a resort town called Vichy. And so it did occur that the unbelievable happened, and the French were out of the war. What to do? Britain was now with its back to the wall. And there was a huge British expeditionary force in France that had been assigned to work with the French army. Now it had to make its way to the Channel, to the coast, to a town that now lives on in history, Dunkirk. And there at Dunkirk, prepare for its evacuation. And amazingly, every ship that could sail, every rowboat that could row, every destroyer that could move forward, everything came from England to Normandy, all the way to Dunkirk, picking up everybody they could pick up and taking them back to England. This amazing event. And in this success, offering hope to a beleaguered people. And as Churchill said, we will go on fighting, if necessary, on the beaches. What he meant was we'd even fight in the streets. We will never surrender. And joining him in this was, of course, those Free French that could get out, led by General Charles de Gaulle, who then went to London also. So you began to have, crowding into London, all the heads of states of the occupied countries, the King of the Belgians, the Queen of the Netherlands, the King of Norway, all there waiting their time, biding their times in hopes that they could return to their occupied countries. Now, was this enough for Herr Hitler? Did he understand what enough was? And the answer was no. So, waiting until 1941, to June of 1941, he launches the largest military operation in history. 3 million German soldiers armed with panzers are going to strike the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. Hitler had already failed in any attempt to invade Britain. He had set it as an objective, Operation Sea Lion, But the leadership of his navy, the Kriegsmarine, had said to him, "We will never be able to cross that channel unless we can have air superiority above our ships. Otherwise, our landing craft are just simply sitting ducks for the Royal Air Force." And sitting ducks they would have been. So then one of those typical idiots who rise to the top in every military, a man who actually in World War I had won the Blue Max as a pilot, is now in charge of the Luftwaffe. It's Goring, of course, idiot supreme. And he says he can do it. He can clear the air over the channel and hold the air long enough for the Wehrmacht to get the army across the channel. Of course, he can't. And as they try, they can't. There's a reason for that. The British have designed the best airplane of World War II. And it's very, very good. And it's dispersed all over the countryside, so you can't find it sitting on any particular landing zone. It's in barns sometimes. It's out in the fields sometimes, under trees, under camouflage. And this airplane will become the workhorse of the British Royal Navy, which by the way, Royal Air Force, which by the way was under the command not of a Brit. Understanding that the entire Commonwealth had to fight this war along with Britain, they gave bomber command to a South African, Bomber Harris, and they gave the fighter command to a guy from New Zealand. So when you looked around Britain, you found a lot of people in command in senior positions who were from the Commonwealth, not from England per se itself. And they were fighting side by side with the British. Because once Herr Hitler realized he could not invade, he then decided to bomb Britain back to the Stone Age, if you wish, and he became the famous Blitz over England, targeting mainly, foolishly, the city of London, because he believed that the British loved their city and they would surrender rather than lose it. But they didn't surrender. They went on fighting, and the Blitz was terrible to live through. And then the brother of that fool who had married that awful American woman, George, the guy who stuttered, who had never expected to be king, he decided that he and his wife and their two daughters would stay in London during the Blitz. They would not desert. And so the war did rage over the skies of London. There's a wonderful writer named Vida Saxwell West who had a marvelous estate in the south of England in the area of Kent. She had a wonderful estate named Sissinghurst. And Sissinghurst was famous for its gardens, particularly its white garden. And she used to sit out in that garden during the Blitz and watch the dogfights between the Messerschmitts that were coming over and the British flyers who were fighting back. And she'd watch them as they parachuted out if they were shot down. And she'd see them slowly floating down to earth. Now, if it was a German who was parachuting, they would be captured and put in a POW camp and live to talk about it. If later, when Britain turned on Berlin with a vengeance and bombed Berlin into a rubble pile, if you had to bail out in Germany, you were sent to a death camp, Buchenwald. I've been there. And in Buchenwald, there is a series of barracks in which British pilots were kept and then executed. But the war went on. Britain fought What did the Americans do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Senators from states like Montana were dead and determined that Franklin Roosevelt would not drag us into another world calamity. But Franklin planned to. He did everything but get impeached. He realized that there were a huge number of deals being struck between London and Washington with his approval. We gave the British 50 destroyers in exchange for some bases on British islands like Bermuda, pushing our frontier further out into the Atlantic. And then he realized that there were big convoys forming off of Halifax in Canada to cross the mighty Atlantic. And it turned out there'd been a young German naval officer in World War I who had been in a German submarine in World War I and been forced to come to the surface and had surrendered and been taken prisoner. And he knew that submarines were a new weapon of war, but they were used badly by the Germans in World War I. But now that he was a high-ranking officer, in fact, he was a Grand Admiral, that he would do it differently. He would use the submarines as wolf packs. They would operate together, 20 or so of them, hiding out in the waters of the North Atlantic, waiting for what? For these huge convoys to try and sink as much as they could, because this aid was going first to Britain, and then later, when the Soviet Union is attacked, it's going to the Soviet Union all the way up to the Arctic, to Murmansk and Archangel. And so it had to be sent to the bottom if the Kriegsmarine was going to play its role. The surface Navy was hopeless. They had built one massive pocket battleship called the Bismarck, way back in the Baltic, where hopefully no one could see it. Finally, the Bismarck did come out. It went north of Scotland, then down between Iceland and Scotland, and then down across the North Atlantic, passing Ireland. And everything the British had, they chased after it with. Finally, they caught up with it as it tried desperately to get under air cover off the coast of France, because France had fallen, and many airplanes and many submarines were hiding in the area of French waters. Unfortunately, the Bismarck did not make it. She was hit by everything that could move. All of the Dutch Navy that remained, all of the British Navy that could be sent forward from Scapa Flow in the north of Scotland. And finally, its propellers were hit, and it was turning circles. And finally, it was hit by enough aircraft that it went to the bottom in the Bay of Biscay off of a French resort called Biarritz. Tragic end for the Bismarck, and a great success for the British Navy's determination that they would play a vital role in the war. Still, the British Spitfires were firing, demanding that they control the airspace over England. The Spitfire was hidden, of course, so that it could never be caught on the ground. And the British had commandeered, basically, the intellectual elite at British universities, at Oxford and Cambridge, at St. Andrews, and across in Ireland at the big Trinity College. And all these people had come together to work, and they had given Britain two weapons out of the academy. One was radar, and one was what the British called ASDIC, or basically that pinging system submarines used to hear when they were being found by a warship above them, sonar. So it was that Roosevelt said, well, what I can do is this. I know the convoys are forming off of the Canadian maritime peninsulas. leaving usually from Halifax. I'm going to send elements of the American Navy up to that area. And then I'm going to send the elements of the American Navy out to sea into the Atlantic Ocean. And what they were to do was to find the German submarines that were waiting, and then to more or less signal and say, here, right here, come here and fire here. And of course, the Americans would do that, waiting for the British warship to actually end the life of that particular U-boat. There's a wonderful German film when Germans started to make good films again. It's called Das Boot. It's the story of the life of a German U-boat during this war, basically in the Mediterranean. Nevertheless, Roosevelt was taking a great chance that this would be discovered by those who were great appeasers, and they would find him guilty of a serious impeachable offense. But it didn't happen. One reason, of course, it doesn't happen is that on a certain day in December of 1941, the Japanese Imperial Fleet sank our fleet at Pearl Harbor. And so now Roosevelt went forward to the Congress and spoke of a day that would live in infamy and asked for a declaration of war. So he had the declaration of war against Japan. And then that incredible Dunkov in Berlin declared war on the United States because, of course, there was an Axis agreement, very weak one, between Tokyo, Rome, and Berlin. But it didn't require Hitler to go to war with any of Japan's enemies. And now he was doing it anyway, inviting another great power to strike at him at the time where he was recognizing that he'd failed in Operation Sea Lion to actually invade the United Kingdom. That Britain was still standing and fighting on in the war and harboring a lot of enemies, the Free French, de Gaulle, all the rest, all the Canadian forces that he could get in, all the Australians. And now he was inviting the Americans in also. So what does he do? Does he draw back? Heavens, no. He decides to tear up his agreement with Stalin, Stalin being stupid enough to have fallen for the trap. And on June 22nd of 1941, he launches Operation Barbarossa. This is the largest military operation ever launched before. 3 million German troops, spearheaded by panzer divisions, are going to cut into 3 slices of the Soviet Union. One slice going north to capture the great city of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg. One going straight towards the center to capture Moscow. And one going to the south, the really important one, to capture the wheat fields of the Ukraine and the black oil of the Caspian Sea, Baku as its center. And it did occur that they did move. Initially, it was under command of rather old Wehrmacht generals. That quickly changed. And again, the great genius of the war, Erich von Manstein, took control of the army going south. He was a thoroughgoing moralist when he received a report that German soldiers in entering the Soviet Union had raped and killed a Russian grandmother. He ordered them executed immediately, and they were. How strange this war. As he continued to push, he began to realize he was working for a madman, better known as Adolf Hitler. But like all of the Prussian, in particular, German officers, there was a long-standing habit that you did not swear allegiance the way we do to a constitution. You swear allegiance to a warlord, and your warlord was Adolf Hitler. But the panzers kept moving. They had very poor choice in how to carry out the air side of Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe flew ahead, and it bombed cities like Warsaw, and it started to bomb Soviet cities, but it simply opened the side doors of the airplane and threw the bombs out by hand, shoveled them out. This is not what you'd call strategic bombing. This is terror bombing, but not strategic. So what it hit, you never knew. Maybe part of the forest, maybe part of a bridge, maybe part of a house. When in fact you had very specific targets you really did want to eliminate. Also, the air power of Germany was limited by the nature of what the close air support meant. You had Stuka dive bombers, and then you had Messerschmitts. But they had limited range, and they flew right over the advancing troops. And then when they ran out of fuel, before they ran out, they landed on unimproved places in the rear, right behind the moving rear, refueled and took off again. But this gave you no long strategic reach for this air arm. And so unlike having someone on the order of the man in charge of the Kriegsmarine, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz and the Wolfpacks, you had a dope-addicted idiot like Göring in charge of the Luftwaffe. Certain death awaited. But you must always remember this. For the rest of World War II, before we're really involved, 80% of the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, were committed to the Russian front. That means that when we land at Normandy, with the British, Canadians, and Free French and others, we're facing only 20% of the German armed forces. There is a difference. The difference comes in this way. It's generally accepted today that the Soviet people, or better, the Russian people, suffered perhaps as many as 25 million killed in the war. We've never suffered anything like that. If you put all of our wars together to include the recent incredibly stupid wars like Vietnam and Iraq, you still don't get anywhere near the figure that the Russians had to pay. In fact, the Russians had a very famous statement about the Americans. They said, oh, the Americans, they'll stay in the war till the last Russian. But the war went on. The war went to the north. It went to Peter the Great's great city, his window on the west, St. Petersburg, renamed, of course, for Lenin, soon to be renamed again, St. Petersburg. There were around 3 million people living in St. Petersburg when the war came. They withstood a 1,000-year siege. They never surrendered. 1 million of them died. 1 million of them were evacuated. There is a lake behind St. Petersburg. There's a river that goes to a lake, Lake Lodoga, which is frozen over. And so 1 million people were evacuated. And there were 1 million who lived, but they lived by trapping rats in the broken down old homes that were now shattered and in ruin. They went into homes and took the wallpaper off the wall and boiled it in water so they could eat the gluey substance. They lived any way they could, but they lived, and they never surrendered. There are two stories I want to tell you about that. Outside of St. Petersburg is a village, Tsar's village, Zarzaseko. It's a city of palaces. In one palace, there's the most fabulous room. It's the amber room. It's a room where every wall is covered in amber. Every piece of furniture, every table, every chair is covered in amber. The sconces are covered in amber. It's the most incredible thing you've ever seen. It was, in fact, taken by the Germans, and the Germans who had given it to the Tsar centuries before now demolished it and took big pieces of the amber when they were treated. And you know how funny those Soviet people are. They rebuilt the amber room piece by piece by piece so that you can visit it today, and it's as magnificent today as it was then. It was a badge of honor for the citizens in that area to have the amber room back. And believe me, it is gorgeous. The other is a story about music. Living in Leningrad at this time was a man who Stalin had never very liked. He had said he was a bad musician. He didn't like his opera, Lady Macbeth from Minsk. And so he sort of disgraced him. And he'd gone back to St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and he was there when this cycle started of invading troops. So he stayed. Then he and his family, his wife and children, were evacuated. But he brought with him a symphony that he had written while the German guns bombarded his city. And he got back across the lake and got back to Moscow. Word of this symphony leaked out, as things do. The symphony was placed into microfilm, and that bit of microfilm was flown down to the south of the Soviet Union, then flew over the Caspian to Tehran, the capital of Iran. From Tehran, it was flown, it's a very little capsule with a microfilm, it was flown to Cairo. From Cairo, it was flown to the old French colonial city of Dakar in Senegal. From Senegal, it was flown to Brazil. From Brazil, it was flown up, and finally the plane landed in a strange little place on Long Island called Idlewild. That's before it was called JFK. And at Idlewild, waiting impatiently as he always did, was a short little feisty Italian, anti-Mussolini to the core, the conductor of the great New York Philharmonic. And he got the musical score in the form of the microfilm, and he raced to get it turned into sheets of music. And then it was played. At the same time, it was played in Moscow. It was played in Manhattan by the New York Philharmonic. A magnificent piece of music known as the Leningrad Symphony, the Seventh, by Shostakovich. A story worth remembering, like the story of the Guernica, the great work of Picasso, and now the story of this piece of music. But still the war went on. Von Manstein had to do something about his front, the Russian front. And in the meantime, there was an odd general on the German side, not a Prussian, no von in his name, Rommel. And Rommel found himself caught up in an Italian caprice. Mussolini had decided to grab some part of this war. He had invaded southern France, big deal. And now he had sent his forces across the Mediterranean into Libya, which was a former Italian colony that had unfortunately been taken away by the British. Now the British had to withdraw towards Egypt. And so you find the Italians following, but the Italians get beaten by the British. Now Hitler is furious because he wants to support his wonderful ally in this dope in Rome. So he sends a German force under the command of Rommel. This force is called the Afrika Corps. Rommel lands with a force in North Africa, in Libya, and is able to turn the tide of war in his favor. He takes Tobruk. He takes Benghazi. He crosses the Egyptian frontier. Now, unfortunately for most people, they don't understand how important this would have been if he could have gone on, as he had hoped, to take Cairo, to then take the canal, the Suez Canal, then cross the canal, and then take the Middle East oil, which is desperately needed by the Third Reich, to come at it from that angle and not necessarily through the Soviet territory. But there is a feisty British guy who takes over the command of Britain's one field army, the Eighth Army, which is located in Egypt, and at a battlefield at El Alamein, he is successful in blocking Rommel. And Rommel is caught in a terrible vice because there is a tempestuous American bully by the name of Georgie Patton. Patton has been out in all places, Palm Springs, in the desert part of Palm Springs, rehearsing with armored divisions, American armored divisions. Not very good armor. The USS didn't build the best tanks in World War II. They just built a lot of them. And now he was going to land that force in time to save Ingrid Bergman and Humphrey Bogart in a very famous film that they had released. In fact, Jack Warner kept that film unreleased until he heard that we had made the famous landings in Morocco. And now coming from that side of Africa and from the other side, you have an Anglo-American force squeezing Rommel in the middle. And now he has to withdraw, form new defensive lines. And Hitler is not the least bit interested in Africa. And he refuses to consider the idea that one of his own field marshals would be captured by those Anglo-Americans. So he orders Rommel home. So Rommel is not captured. The Afrika Corps is finally captured in Tunisia. Rommel almost destroys, by the way, Patton at Kasserine Pass. So if you ask who were the better general, I think you would have to say it was Rommel. Rommel is out. The Afrika Corps is taken prisoner along with lots of Italians. They're put on ships and they're sent back to the United States, of all places, to POW camps, where they end up in camps that you would see them in Arkansas and Texas. And they'd be working because the Americans knew that you weren't able to work prisoners of war legally in a war plant, but you could at least make them grow their own food. So you'd see these people out there singing Italian and German songs as the war went on. Unfortunately, some of those ships that the Italians and Germans were on were sunk by German submarines. So they never made it except to a very watery grave. Rommel came home. He was sent finally by Herr Hitler to help von Rundstedt. Who was von Rundstedt? Von Rundstedt was the Oberkommando West. He was the overall commander of the Western Front, the Festung Europa, to block any possibility of the Americans and British and French and Canadians landing. But he saw that his job was hopeless also. And so the landings did take place, as you well know. We came ashore. We speedily took Paris. We left Paris for a couple of people. Hemingway snuck ashore so that he could go and liberate the Ritz Bar in Paris. And Churchill himself had tried to come ashore with the first landing, and Eisenhower simply picked up the phone and asked to speak to the king. And when the king came to the phone, he said, "Your Majesty, you have to do something about your first minister. He cannot come ashore in the first landings at Normandy." And the king said, "I will take care of that." And he ordered the prime minister to stay behind, which killed Churchill. So as soon as he could sneak away, Churchill himself went ashore at Normandy on the second day landings. And so it was, we began to pile across Europe. We had some very foolish moves. We let Montgomery plan something called Market Garden, which meant running a big campaign up through the Netherlands, where the Germans simply flooded the area of the dikes. The Dutch people were already starving to death. They were digging up jonquils and tulips and eating the bulbs. That's how bad food conditions were. And so it was that we came to the Rhine. We capture an intact bridge, the Remagen Bridge. We stream across the Rhine. Other people ask other questions. We also had landed in Italy, and we'd gone ashore at Anzio. And then later we went another shoreline campaign out of first Anzio, and then it was near Nettuno. But the interesting point, and by the way, in that famous campaign up the Italian Canal boot, there is a magnificent monastery along the way, Monte Cassino, and the Germans had fortified it. And so what did we have as a choice? But we blew it up. One of the masterpieces of the Middle Ages. By the way, the Benedictine monks have rebuilt it rock by rock, stone by stone. It's perfectly intact today if you ever take the autostrada from Naples to Rome. And as we streamed up the Italian peninsula, we came to Rome, which was an open city, which is a brilliant film by Roberto Rossellini later. And we got to bases in Foggia, which are important because from Foggia, we could have done something if we thought it possible. Many people have asked after the war why we did not bomb Auschwitz, killing obviously the people that were there, but allowing it not to be used any longer as a death camp. And it's true that we didn't. And it's true also that the Italians killed their Jews. There's a brilliant masterpiece, I think the best of the Holocaust films. It's called The Garden of the Finzi Contini by De Sica. The Finzi Contini were a famous Italian Jewish family, and they were sent to a death camp. One of the few people I know of in Italy at the time who did anything to help was certainly not the Pope in Rome, but it was a fat, jolly cardinal in Venice. You know him as John the 23rd, but at this time he was just a fat, jolly cardinal. But he hid and saved as many Venetian Jews as he could. An act of courage. So we came up the peninsula. We had a luck in that we had OSS people. The Office of Strategic Services was our version of a CIA, and they were operating out of Switzerland. Alan Dulles was a young man in the group, and he met with a field marshal, an air marshal by the name of Kesserling, and he worked out a ceasefire agreement in Italy with Kesserling, which meant an end of the war effectively on the Italian boot. But still we had to get into Germany itself. And we slowly did. And as I see my time is beginning to run out, which always happens, I talk too much. So I'll have to do another one. We'll have to do World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, and the Japanese War in the Pacific. But for right now, you have to know that President Roosevelt worked feverishly during the war for the war effort. He agreed, even in his bad conditions, to meet with Churchill and Stalin at Tehran, and to go on to Cairo to meet with Chiang Kai-shek. And he agreed also that he would meet again at Yalta. If you see the pictures of him at Yalta, you're looking at a dying man. And he did die before the final peace talks could be held at Potsdam. So we have instead Harry Truman and Stalin, and then the silly, silly Brits. So tired of war, so tired of doing without, that they did not re-elect Prime Minister Churchill. And so a new British Prime Minister shows up at Potsdam. So Stalin's the only old-timer. Stalin, the man who has already killed millions back in the Soviet Union. So it was. Van Manstein, by the way, the greatest of the German generals, was fired by Herr Hitler toward the end of the war because he had dared to give up a little bit of territory. And he lived after the war to write a magnificent book, Lost Victories. And Guderian, the other great panzer leader, led the attack on Moscow, which never fell, even though Stalin had run away behind the Ural Mountains, no less. While our war materials to Stalin, Lindley, as it was called, was coming in via the road up the Persian Gulf, landing in Iran, with the Russians coming down halfway and us taking it up halfway. And they got everything they wanted. Sheet steel, enough armaments to build an air force. We were the workhorse. And the funny thing was, we ended up building a bridge of ships all the way to Europe. They are the Liberty ships that you see if you go up to where they were built here in the Bay Area. We were the biggest shipbuilding center in the world in 1943-44. And Long Beach was the biggest shipbuilding. We built everything the British requested. Since they already had the best fighter, they asked us to build them bombers, and we built bomber after bomber. The guy who did this is named Douglas. Donald Douglas, you might have heard of him. And so it was that we became the arsenal of democracy. Yes, we lost lots of casualties. The saddest thing I can think of the war, it always reminds me of a novel by Günter Grass, a great German writer. The novel is called Crab Walk. It's the story of a freighter loaded down with children, some of them 2 years old, that were being quickly taken out of the eastern zone of Germany in order to avoid being killed by the approaching Cossacks, as they were called by the Germans. And this ship was torpedoed in the Baltic. And the next morning, the shores of the Baltic were covered in the bodies of 2-year-old children. Well, it's 4:05 and they're going to shoot me if I talk any longer, so I'll have to come back next week and cover the Pacific War. Thank you for coming this afternoon to listen to another presidential talk. Stay well.